I am so thrilled and honored that I now get to introduce to you Amy Spitalnick. Amy, as many of you know, is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, the JCPA. This is a national convener of Jewish coalitions working across communities to build a more just and inclusive democracy. Amy has been now for many years a leader in the work on countering anti-Semitism, hate, and extremism, and protecting democracy. And we are going to talk today about how absolutely intertwined those things are. But you may know of Amy, first and foremost, for her work in Charlottesville. Amy served as the executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups that were responsible for the violence in Charlottesville. So first of all, we thank you for that incredible and courageous and absolutely critical work. I want to launch us into the conversation by first just framing a word from our Torah portion, which there's a long list of pluralized blessings and curses. And it's very clear to me that it's not that the individual who behaves in a certain way will have that behavior come back to them. It means that when we contribute to a culture of violence and hate and racism and human cruelty, that we are now living in a society that is infused with hatred and racism and cruelty and violence. And so part of what our Parsha is trying to awaken in us is that every one of us is in fact responsible for the social environment that we live in. And Amy, the work that you have done is both to go into some of the deepest and darkest places to understand what's actually going on in the heart of the movements that are driving a lot of the hatred that is manifesting in our country now, and also to figure out what are pathways through it. So I want you to start us off in our conversation with talking about how anti-Semitism is operating in this moment and how that intersects with questions of democracy and why you think it's so essential that these two are part of one conversation.
Well, first, thank you for having me. I live in New York, so getting to spend a Shabbat at IKAR is also like a dream of mine, and I have such admiration and appreciation for what all of you are doing in this community, and Rabbi Brous especially. Just your wisdom has been so formative to my own work, and so really grateful to be here. It's a moment when it really feels like, for those of us who care about Jewish values and Jewish identity, it's coming from all directions right now. And you talked about Charlottesville. And in many ways, for me, those images from Charlottesville of Nazis with torches were really what we know now, 8 years later, a harbinger of the anti-Semitism, broader hate and extremism, and threats to democracy that have become so pervasive and normalized in our politics and our society. And we only need to look at the news this week to be reminded why. And it's important to understand that, of course, anti-Semitism operates like so many forms of hate, hating Jews because of who we are and what we look like, how we pray or don't pray. And we all know, of course, that looks different for each and every Jew, as we've been talking about today. But what's unique about anti-Semitism and why it's so inextricably linked with the fight for our democracy is that it also operates as this insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory rooted in tropes and lies around Jewish control and power, right? Jews will not replace us. At the time, 8 years ago, many of us had no idea what they were even talking about, myself included. But now we know that this idea that there is some Jewish conspiracy to replace the white race, to steal our elections, to support immigrants and refugees, to otherwise advance a vision for this country that these extremists abhor, right? This has become so normalized, and it's fueled not just attacks on Jews, as we saw in Charlottesville, where the Black and Jewish communities were particularly surrounded and targeted, and Heather Heyer was murdered, and so many others injured. Pittsburgh, the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in U.S. history at Tree of Life. Poway, right here in California. El Paso, where the Latino community was targeted with the same anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic conspiracy theory. Buffalo, New York, where the Black community was targeted. Christchurch, New Zealand, where the Muslim community was targeted. And now, of course, these conspiracy theories aren't just leading to mass violence, as we know so well, but also really fueling and animating dangerous, draconian, dehumanizing policies that we just also need to turn on the news or look at on our streets to understand. ICE raids and attacks on immigrants, the efforts to roll back voting rights under the guise of, quote unquote, protecting the integrity of our election, and so much more. So we know how anti-Semitism is this conspiracy theory, doesn't threaten Jews, but threatens so many communities and the core of our democracy in that way. And I'll also say, especially in a post-October 7th world, it's so crucial that we be clear-eyed about how this conspiracy manifests on the far left as well, particularly with efforts to use conspiracy theories related to Jewish control and power, and to use the issue of Israel and Gaza as a guise to effectively marginalize, isolate, and divide Jews from the very spaces and coalitions that we need to be in, whether it is in the form of targeting Jews for the actions of the Israeli government, seeking to ban and boycott Jews or quote-unquote Zionists from spaces, and of course, as we've seen over the last few months, this manifesting in increasingly violent ways, whether it's the firebombing of Governor Josh Shapiro's home on Passover, the attack at the Capitol Jewish Museum, or the attack in Boulder, Colorado, not very long ago. And so we see how anti-Semitism is used to undermine democracy, sow political violence and broader extremism across the political spectrum. And because it's this conspiracy theory, it really is a salient wedge across the ideological spectrum. And I'll end by saying we're also being offered false choices on both ends of the political spectrum that are intended to, again, undermine our democracy and pit the Jewish community against others. On the right, we're seeing everyone from the president to a variety of other folks use our legitimate and real fears of anti-Semitism to go after the core institutions and democratic norms and values that have been so inherent to our safety and advancement in the Jewish community and the safety of so many communities. Gutting billions of dollars in cancer and Alzheimer research from universities, deporting students and others without due process, seeking to revoke the charter of labor unions, so much more. Then this false choice between Jewish safety and democracy is being set up to, again, pit us against one another and use our fears to undermine our core norms and values. And of course, on the other side, these efforts to effectively say it's impossible to be proudly Jewish, to have a relationship with Israel, and to do so in a way that is also deeply committed to democratic and humanitarian values. And I think this community and so many of us illustrate that all of those things are possible at the same time, that we can have deep care and fear for the lives of both Israelis and Palestinians. We can be proudly Jewish and do so without walking away from our democratic and core progressive or liberal or justice values. And these false choices are intended to make us feel like that's not possible.
Thank you. I had a disturbing conversation recently with a good friend who's just in anguish over what's happening in the Jewish community, and said, you know what, I will take any friend I can get. I'm not looking at the broader scope of what any of these efforts that are ostensibly to protect the Jewish community are actually doing. I don't care if they have a different agenda. If they're saying that they're a friend of mine, I need any friend I can take right now. And I felt so deeply saddened by that, because I had this sense that the Jews have this long history of thousands of years, and instead of being really having this long vision, we're getting very short-sighted, and we're looking for the immediate gain. Like, in the immediate, I need to feel safe, and if what it takes to make me feel safe today undermines higher education, or undermines multiracial democracy, or undermines, any kind of democracy, I'm willing to take it. We'll fix that later. Right now, I need to be safe. And I think what's so important about your work, and what I'd like to understand more about, is the way in which democratic institutions themselves are the way to keep Jews safe, along with keeping all of the rest of the people in this country safe. And so when we undermine those very institutions, to do so in the name of Jewish safety is an absurdity. It makes no logical sense. For example, the defunding of the Office of Civil Rights. Recently, we found out that the person from the administration who's responsible for ensuring that Harvard was going to be keeping its Jewish students safe actually has a kind of deep affinity for Hitler, and his favorite book was Mein Kampf. So there's a kind of absurdity to the idea that our pain could be remedied by people and by objectives that seem to me objectively more dangerous to us. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, look, we're in this feedback loop, right? I talked about, well, no one's ever accused me of being quiet, but I will try to speak up. We're in this feedback loop. I talked about how anti-Semitism as this conspiracy theory is used to fuel and undermine threats, or fuel threats to democracy and undermine our society. But so too, as our democratic norms and values erode and all communities are threatened, it creates the conditions for anti-Semitism to further flourish. First and foremost, I should note, because of the diversity of our own communities, so many Jews are facing compounded forms of extremism and bigotry right now, but also because when there's distrust in our society and our government, people are looking for someone to blame. And I don't need to tell the Jewish community that we are so often among the first blamed, right? And so we're in this feedback loop where anti-Semitism is undermining democracy, and threats to our democracy are making it easier for anti-Semitism to flourish. And we have to break out of it. There's so much to say about sort of what we would actually do if we wanted to fight anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. Right now, we are being told that the only way to fight it is to turn inward, to effectively pit the Jewish community against others, to avoid conversations and relationships and coalitions with others with whom we might have disagreements on Israel or Gaza or on any other issue, and to effectively walk away from our core norms and values and institutions. And in particular, we're seeing this play out in a very real way, where the core institutions of our government and our democracy are being undermined, even as the administration and others claim they are protecting Jewish safety. So you talked about the Office of Civil Rights. This is the office that implements Title VI, which keeps Jewish and all students safe in K through 12 schools and on college campuses. Already stretched thin under the Biden administration. It's been gutted under the Trump administration over the last 9 months. Hate crimes prevention grants, the core work that actually prevents acts of hate and violence in our communities, decimated under Trump. Nonprofit security grants, which literally provide the security that is keeping us safe here and in synagogues around the country this Shabbat morning. They were frozen first by the administration, and now they are effectively being weaponized by the Department of Homeland Security with these terms and conditions telling recipients that they either need to cooperate with ICE or quote-unquote ban illegal DEI in their institutions.
I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that. Can you just say that last piece again? Because this just happened in the last 2 weeks, and it's really critical for us to understand this.
Yeah, so the administration has effectively decided that the core security grants, again, they provide for physical security at synagogues and in multi-faith institutions around this country, are somehow going to be used as a political football to advance an agenda. So within these terms and conditions of the new grants that were recently released, there's specific language telling synagogues, churches, mosques, other institutions that receive them that they may need to allow ICE into their facilities or cooperate with immigration enforcement, or that they need to, quote, ban illegal DEIA. We don't even know what that means, right? It could mean anything. In a community like this, it could quite literally mean all of us showing up or having an LGBTQ affinity group at a synagogue or a Jews of color group or anything like that, right? And the idea there is to effectively make institutions choose between their physical safety and our core religious beliefs and values. And that, for me, is a core issue of religious freedom. It's telling us as Jews and so many others that we can't proudly practice the values and the beliefs that are inherent to so many of our Judaism if we want to also protect ourselves. Yeah. Exactly. And again, it's these false choices where the very fabric of our democratic institutions and norms are being weaponized in a way that pits us against others and fundamentally tells us that we as Jews have to choose, when in reality we know there's no Jewish safety without inclusive democracy, and there's no inclusive democracy without Jewish safety.
I want to move us to talk, and I know that this is hard, but about the Jewish community and the way that we inside the Jewish community react and respond to anti-Semitism. It seems to me that there's a pattern that plays out over the course of the past many years, which is somebody does something that's anti-Semitic, and the Jewish community reacts overwhelmingly, the established Jewish community, with kind of a sledgehammer, and then there's a massive reaction to the Jewish community's reaction, and suddenly we're in this peak escalation. I know there must be another way. It seems to me that we respond to every threat as if it's a nuclear threat, and we respond to every criticism as if it's a Nazi, and that's led us to a point of not being able to actually discern between real threats, which I believe do exist, and just discomfort, which it's okay for us to be uncomfortable in the world. And so I want to think a little bit with you about the dangers to the Jewish community when we fail to discern between what makes us uncomfortable and what makes us unsafe.
There's so much to say about this, and like every day it feels like there's another example of someone who has, in many ways, done real harm to the Jewish community in some ways. But being able to figure out what the best path forward is to address that harm is something that sometimes we're not able to actually calibrate. And we use, as you said, a sledgehammer in a moment when we need to be thinking strategically about how do we build the strongest possible coalitions in support of Jewish safety and inclusive democracy at a moment when both are under threat. And so I'll say two things. One, we're not even speaking the same language as other people, right? Even within the Jewish community, we're not speaking the same language. What does Zionism mean to me versus the person sitting next to me versus the person shouting it on a college campus versus how it's being used on social media? What does the word intifada mean to me as a Jew whose formative relationship with Israel developed during the Second Intifada versus, an Arab American college student who's using it peacefully on campus versus someone who's shouting it when they violently attack a Jew, right? We're not even speaking the same language, and so that in many ways allows us to go to that place of just reactiveness as opposed to engagement. And so our work at JCPA, and I think really the only path forward here, is to build the muscle to stay at the table and figure out what we are even saying to each other and how we're hearing it and the harm it may be causing. So I'll share an anecdote. I'm sure everyone here knows Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, where I live. And there are some strong feelings about AOC in the Jewish community. She is someone who has been accused by some in our community of anti-Semitism. And of course, even if you don't believe that she is engaged in anti-Semitism, which many don't, there's real disagreement over policy on Israel and Gaza. And so last summer, she invited me to do a webinar for her social media followers on anti-Semitism. And I said, yes, when else would an audience like that hear from someone like me, someone who identifies as a progressive Zionist, who has a relationship with Israel, who talks about that in the context of understanding anti-Semitism? How do you say no to that? Right? At a time when we're so fearful of anti-Semitism. You would have thought that both she and I were criminals for talking to one another. On the right of our community, I was told I'm normalizing anti-Semitism by sitting down with a US Congresswoman. And she was effectively canceled by the far left, including after this webinar being unendorsed by part of the Democratic Socialists. I would encourage folks to actually watch the webinar. It's 35 minutes, it's online. We had a very frank conversation about everything that we're talking about here, anti-Semitism in all its forms, on the left, on the right, what Zionism actually means to me as an American Jew, which for me simply is the belief in Jewish self-determination somewhere in this place in the world where we have historical connections. It's not support for the Israeli government and its actions, and it actually, for me, goes hand in hand with my belief in Palestinian self-determination, humanity, and dignity. And that's a very different understanding of Zionism than perhaps a lot of people watching may have had, and certainly AOC on this webinar said important things about the threat anti-Semitism poses to progressivism and our values. And the next day in New York, we had this horrific anti-Semitic protest outside the Nova Memorial down by Wall Street. And she put out an unequivocal statement naming that as anti-Semitism at a time when there were some trying to conflate that with protest of Israel. And as I said, afterwards, she was unendorsed. But for me, the ways in which staying at that table, having that conversation with people who were willing to do that, with an elected official who was willing to have those conversations across lines of difference, the Jewish leader who I was eager and willing to do the same, that's the only path forward. How are we possibly going to address anti-Semitism if we're not engaging people outside of the Jewish community who aren't already with us? But we're being told by so many that the only people we can talk to are those already with us. And how do you possibly solve anything if that's the case?
Well, I thank you for sharing that. I want to lift up Jonathan Jacoby's name here. Jonathan yesterday sent me something that he shared that I want to lift up because I think it points to a hard conversation we need to have inside our Jewish community about people who claim to be acting on behalf of Jews and Jewish safety, who are engaging sometimes in behavior that I think is very reckless and actually undermines our safety. So Jonathan spoke directly to one of these organizations that now is famous for making lists of top anti-Semites of the week and including essentially anybody who expresses sympathy toward Palestinians who are dying in Gaza and in the West Bank. And so this week, they, of course, named the people responsible for the artists' boycott, which over 4,000 artists signed in the past week, saying that they won't work with Israeli filmmakers. And I will say that I know that there are many people now, Israeli and Palestinian filmmakers who work together who've said, actually, this isn't helpful. This isn't the way, because we're the ones who are trying to tell a different story. But the people who signed that boycott were called by this Jewish organization called Nazis. And what Jonathan said is the following. He said, hey, Jewish organization, stop calling people who sign boycotts against Israel Nazis. This is trivializing the Holocaust. This is disrespecting members of my own family, he says, who were killed by actual Nazis. And please stop undermining the one thing that kept my parents safe under the Nazi regime and that makes Jews safe today, which is American democracy, which is freedom of speech, which is freedom to debate, freedom to disagree. Stop using this incendiary language. It is actually endangering our people, and it's also insulting to the history that our people have suffered through. I think it's what a lot of us are feeling. If literally everyone is a Nazi, what does that say about actual Nazis, both from the past and also, as you well know, from our present? And so I think this is an absolutely critical moment. The voices of people who are very clear in their black and white binary thinking are the loudest voices. And yet you consistently show up with, I think, an incredibly profound message that it is essential is heard in this space. Because people like you and like Jonathan, who are trying to expand the thinking, need to be heard, because we don't want to make a choice between our safety as Jews and American democracy. On the question of language and definitions, this is a very hot topic today, and if we had more time together, we would look at the language of these definitions. But there's a debate going on both internally and now in our state houses about definitions of anti-Semitism, because people need to know, is it anti-Semitic if somebody, what qualifies an act or certain language as anti-Semitic? Can you just give us your brief take on what the difference is that matters between these definitions, also being argued at the California State House, among other places, and what we should keep in mind as we hear the debates raging about how we even define anti-Semitism?
Well, there's so much to say about the three definitions and how we define any form of hate, and the fact that we're only really arguing over, do we codify into law a definition of anti-Semitism when we're not codifying into law any other definition of any other form of hate? And so for me, that gets to the crux of it. Of course, we need to make sure there is strong, broad-based understanding of anti-Semitism and all of its complexity and nuances, including as it relates to Israel at a time when in our schools, in our campuses, and elsewhere, we are seeing very real anti-Semitism. But the question is, do we treat these definitions as core resources, as they were intended by those who crafted them? Or do we seek to codify them into law in a way that raises very real civil liberties and civil rights concerns that, again, pits Jewish safety against core democratic norms? So there's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition, IRA, which is a definition that JCPA has always used as a core resource, and also has been clear should not be legally binding. There's the Nexus definition that Johnny's organization leads, which is, I think, intended to really dive into more of the nuances around where that line is between criticism of Israel and where when it becomes anti-Semitism. And then there's the Jerusalem Declaration as well, which I would say is sort of like the left flank of that, for lack of a better term. But for me, the real question is, how do we prevent these fights from becoming the red herrings that allow leaders to avoid accountability for not doing the things we actually need to keep us safe? So if the federal government wants to protect Jews, I don't think it's about codifying IRA into law. It's about restoring and expanding funding for Title VI in the Office of Civil Rights. It's restoring the hate crimes prevention grants that they've cut. It's not using nonprofit security as a political football. It's not appointing people with neo-Nazi views to lead our counter-extremism offices or hold roles at the Department of Defense. It's not normalizing anti-Semitic and racist conspiracy theories that have already fueled a cycle of violence targeting Jews and so many others. And so often these fights are being used as red herrings to avoid leaders, to allow leaders to avoid doing the things that matter. I'll say, last night, California passed a bill focused on anti-Semitism that didn't codify into law a definition of anti-Semitism. We can do both things. We can fight anti-Semitism, and we can do it in a way that doesn't threaten the core civil liberties that have been so inherent to our safety as Jews, whether it is through some of the ways in which this definitional fight is playing out, or the ways in which our broader safety is being pitted against democracy.
Thank you for that. Our time is short, so I want to just ask one final question. I want to just bring us to David Nirenberg's book, Anti-Judaism, for one moment, which, for those who haven't read it, is this really kind of sweeping history that argues that anti-Judaism is not only hatred of Jews, which we call anti-Semitism, but is a kind of framework for understanding, making sense of the world in which the Jew becomes representative of everything that's wrong in the world at that particular moment. And so if it's materialism that's wrong, the Jew becomes the embodiment of materialism. If it's cosmopolitanism, the Jew's the cosmopolitan. If it's communism, the Jew is the communist, et cetera, et cetera. And essentially, the Jew becomes responsible for all of the pain of the society. And I was just reading the paper this morning before I came and seeing how the administration now is blaming George Soros for the shooting that happened this week. And it's like, George Soros is 95 years old, by the way, and God bless him. He can't do, no matter what goes wrong, George Soros is responsible in the eyes of some. When you see this kind of thing, and you know that the people who created the ideology and the manufacturers who built the guns and make the profit off of the sale of guns are not going to be held accountable, but George Soros is going to be held accountable and blamed, you start to lose hope for America. I don't want to get false hope from you. I want to understand what we can do in this moment because we're not helpless. And even though we see the way the winds are blowing here, I do believe that every one of us is responsible for doing what we can to try to restore some kind of sanity, moral clarity, compassion, and vision for what is possible in this country as Jewish Americans. So I would love if you could close us with your sense of what it is that we can do in this moment.
Wholeheartedly agree with sort of that framing around how Jews are so often used as the excuse, right? And so we know this. We talk, right? Jews will not replace us in the ways in which Jews were responsible for the demographic changes, the voting, the elections being stolen, et cetera. And I will say it's important to also note, just as we hear efforts by the administration and others to demonize Soros or other, shadowy Jewish cabals for what they see as wrong, of course, we're also living at a moment where there are those on the far left who will blame Israel or those who believe it should exist or support it for everything that's wrong in our society as well, right? And both of these things are true. The path forward is one in which we reject those false binaries, those false choices that we are being offered, and there's a number of specific things that each of us can do. And this might be ironic as someone who worked on a lawsuit against neo-Nazis, but I don't believe that we're going to sue, prosecute, or barricade our way out of this crisis. We need the physical security. We need the accountability in courts and through the criminal justice system for people who harm us and who spread hate and violence and extremism. But we also ultimately need to build the core democratic resiliency to prevent this hate and extremism from taking hold in the first place. And we do this in a variety of ways. We can do this through public policies. I've talked about a number of them. It's teaching media and digital literacy, which is quite literally something each and every one of us in this room can do in our own homes, not just with our kids. I have a 3-year-old who's already frighteningly nimble on YouTube, right? So I think about this every day. But frankly, for us as adults as well, and ensuring that our schools on the state and local levels where these policies are made are actually teaching people how to be smarter and better consumers of the news, so that while we're still learning, for example, what motivated the shooter, the shooter who murdered Charlie Kirk, we do know that this was like an extremely online person who engaged in a number of extremist memes. That leads to real-world consequences targeting Jews and political figures and others across the political spectrum. And if we teach people how to actually be smarter consumers of the news, we build the resiliency to this taking hold in the first place. It's investing in our democratic institutions, particularly on the state and local level right now, because we know it's not happening on the federal level. It's quite literally showing up to escort immigrants at immigration court and protect our poll places and make sure people have access to the ballot at a time when it's under dire threat. It's showing up in communities like this, not just proudly living Jewishly at a time when some are trying to prevent us from doing so, but showing what it means to live Jewishly in a way that is inherent and inextricably linked with our core democratic values and our values of social justice, which this community does. And so it's ultimately about building the resiliency to these false choices and the false binaries of extremism that seek to pit us against one another and allow these democratic norms and institutions to be eroded at a time when we as Jews need to be protecting them like our lives depend on it, because they do.
Amy, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to sit with you in person and hear from you, and I really hope that God blesses you with continued health and strength and moral clarity, and that your voice should be heard. It's really important and profound, and I thank you so much for being with us.